be talking with Shirley Steinberg. She was a professor of my thesis chair, Leila Villaverde, and they were very close. And so that's when I became aware of Shirley, and she helped publish some early works of mine. And so I've been an admirer and of her work for a long, long time in the field. So I'm very excited to be talking with her today. So, anyways,
Yeah, Shirley,
Shirley,
way back. Way how many years, Shirley? 30, 20?
Yeah, I think I met you the year I met Joe, and you were just starting to see Mary.
Yeah.
And so was that 89 or 90?
So yeah, about that time.
Yeah, so I've known you since then. I
Yeah,
was always impressed by how you dressed with this fabulous vest and acted like the maitre d'. And it was I just thought you were the most wonderful person. You were just adorable.
Thank you. Well, that was a long time ago. My goodness, the Bergamo days.
There's genealogy for you.
I'll tell you, yeah, boy. But you have a connection with Georgia Southern, with
I
Brian Weaver.
Yeah, I do. I have a mixed bag, happy, sad connection. And that's actually how I got involved in the notion of genealogy. Kinchelo and I and Brian Deaver and probably you and everybody else we're at a conference, and Brian and I started talking, and I had been married to a Mormon. And so Mormons were heavy on genealogy. And so we somehow got onto the idea of genealogy. And he started talking to me said, I have this idea. And he said, we need to, and then Kinchelo came in. So we all sat for the afternoon, talked about creating genealogy of where we came from ideologically and spiritually and in our narrative ways, just how we were, that to us that biography and autobiography didn't count unless we had a genealogy behind it. And so to look at the current and where we were going. And so we decided that we would become committed to doing a genealogy project of the left, basically of the left people in pedagogy, some in the reconceptualist movement, some in critical pedagogy. But the idea of those people, what is their story and where were they from? Unfortunately, as you all know, more than unfortunately, horribly, Brian was killed very soon after that. But in all these years, it's been, a long time. In all those years, I've always had it in the back of mind that we need to preserve us before we're all gone. And there's, a few that have gone, but I remember when Paulo Freire died in 1997, and having to work to try to preserve things. There was nothing really there of where he came from. And we all knew he was from Recife. We all knew that he had been incarcerated. We all knew those things, but we didn't know the nitty gritty stuff, especially as non-Portuguese speaker. And I think that those stories are important stories. Our backgrounds are important. Like when I think about the Frankfurt School, it's important for me to know where they came from and how they ended up in Frankfurt as the most powerful group of ideologues and philosophers of the time. And we're all Jews in Germany. And I think those stories are important, and those stories that follow them through. And some of the Frankfurt School had really weird, creepy, sad, brilliant stories as they went. And so that's my tree. That's my ancestral tree. And I believe that that's important. And it's one of the reasons that I have my students always write an autobiography, whether it's the first year university or if it's their final, I'm just coming into my doctoral program, or if they're a new doc student who comes in the middle. They have to write their story. And maybe it's not so much an autobiography, but a story. I need to know their narrative, because I truly believe that as teachers and researchers and humans, we need to know where we came from. And I don't know that if it's I don't think it's particularly a loyalty, but it's an opening up of our minds to understand and to make a difference. And so that's why I was, besides getting to see Dan and Marla, I was excited to do this because of that notion of genealogy, which almost 20 years ago had been kind of a sealed deal with a really special person who left the world very early. And that the fact that he was a professor at Georgia Southern, and it's definitely that coming around feeling.
It's
I didn't
really
even know
interesting.
about that.
I didn't know about that either, but it's interesting that it came up again at Georgia Southern, that somehow that was part of the DNA there, or something that was lit again in the same place.
It's that it's the notion of coincidental non-coincidences.
Hmm.
And I think those are important. And I'm not starry-eyed enough to say the universe is speaking to me, but maybe we should allow things that are coincidental or that are seminal in our lives, just let them in to speak to us.
Hmm.
Well, look at the book I just got.
Oh, wow.
I am totally, my whole shelf is Walter Benjamin, and I'm teaching a seminar on him. Talk about weird. I didn't know you were into the Frankfurt School. I'm
Oh,
just
absolutely.
I'm just finding this now in my early 60s. I really didn't know much about it because, when I was studying, nobody read this stuff. I mean, it's not it's not like in this book, because guess what? It comes out of England, and the Frankfurt School was very marginalized in
Hmm.
traditional philosophy.
But it shouldn't be in education, and that has always disturbed me. And I think that's where the big severing of the reconceptualist movement and the what we'll call the Bergamo conference people came was actually in the very early years, when you had people who were good friends like Giroux and Pinar and Apple, and people who did, saw the world and saw education in a very similar way, and were all very good pedagogues. But what they didn't see was the difference in the political and the non-political. It's always been my criticism of the reconceptualists, because I felt them as an apolitical group, especially their early writings. And I much more adhered to those who went toward the Frankfurt School, which would be Giroux and McLaren. And I do apologize up front for all the essentialists who don't like me mentioning white men. But when white men are the only ones who start a movement, you can't very well stop talking about them. So that's my little throwback to those who critique this. But that's really the reality of how things severed. And Apple was able to walk, Apple in his way could always walk on both sides. And he's interesting in that respect. But the notion of the Frankfurt School, which widens Marxism into stopping being such an economical and an issue of capital, and then takes us to the point in cultural studies in Frankfurt School, but cultural studies birthed from the Frankfurt School, that the capital of culture has got to be examined and interrogated. And all of this, though, does go back to Marx and the understanding that if we do not understand power, we do not have a voice in the world, and we also have no way to instruct or work with our students. And that's to the point of a 6-year-old kindergarten curriculum in looking at power, or a 3rd-year doctoral student research class looking at power. But I believe that criticalization from critical theory insists that instead of looking at capital, instead of looking at economics, instead of looking at sex, race, gender, power in any other way, power itself has to be examined.
Mm. So Marla, I'm interested in the fact that you're turning toward the Frankfurt School now, coming from a reconceptualist framework and an apolitical, I wouldn't say apolitical, but that was secondary to your work.
Well, actually, it wasn't. My first book was on the Holocaust, and
Very good point.
I did early work on some of this stuff, back then, and big fan of Hannah Arendt, who I'm also teaching right now, and all of that. And then I kind of got away from that because I couldn't deal with the trauma. You know, you get re-traumatized every time you write another book about that. But I'm kind of going backwards now. And just I don't know. It just I I'm doing a project with Michael Peters right now, a book called Innovations in Education, and my section was on curriculum theory. So the assignment was for the writers to talk about how are you innovative. And it was a really tough thing for me because I'm like, well, what am I doing now that I wasn't doing then? And I'm like, I started looking around my bookshelves, unconsciously aware that, boy, I sure have a lot of Benjamin around here. I'm like, oh, I think there's a pattern. Like I never even realized it. So now I'm really focusing on his work and on the Frankfurt School and like asking the question, like, why hasn't this been part of my education? Why did it fall off off the curriculum somewhere? So now I'm teaching the seminar on Benjamin. And Arendt and other people. Not that it hasn't been there, it's just that I haven't been really aware. And I think the older I get, the more maybe, we talk about looking back at your Jewish roots and all of that. That's becoming more and more important to me. Not that it always hasn't, but now it's becoming more of an issue being in the South and living through Trump and and living through all this anti-Semitism and racism and trying to figure out parallels in history. And so, yeah, it's just, I think it's all kind of been there, but it hasn't come together until relatively recently for me. So,
Mhm.
Shirley, that's interesting that you mentioned that because that's what I'm doing right now.
But Marla, I've known your work for many, many years, and you're one of the top intellects in our field. And I think you've had a lot of this critical theory all through your life. And yes, you have always been a very political person. I think it's interesting on the book that you and Peters are doing, because my piece that I'm sending to you in a couple days, my chapter in yours is to basically make the assertion that the greatest curriculum one can use is the notion of no curriculum. So that decurriculumizing is what the best thing we can do for education. And critical theory allows me to make those assertions, but because by understanding where power works in the notion of curriculum theory and how reconceptualism or traditional curriculum has always been, kind of taxonomized within a set of power. So how do we move away from power which is not working, and our schools are failing, our kids are failing, even those who graduate are failing. And as we know, when we get our first year undergraduate students, we could pretty well assume that a great percentage of them really are almost illiterate. And so and yet they have high school degrees and they actually made it into a college. So there's something we're doing wrong in a lot of ways. And I think that those old fashioned traditionalized mandates are very difficult for us to shake because we're sort of in a world that puts us in taxonomies.
Well, they're becoming more, the mandate's becoming stricter and stricter, where they're now, you have to spit it out on a test. And the students and the teachers are all becoming de-skilled. We have doctoral students that can barely write. And that's very sad that they come to us at, middle age, and they're saying, this is the first time I've had a real education, where I'm able to think, where I'm able to explore what interests them, this notion of no curriculum. And the literacy that you see even at the doctoral level is shameful.
Exactly. And it's funny, we just go back to the same circle of the critiques of education that began when we were educators, the same concept. And it is a political conversation because there's no one else that organizes education but the politicians and those in power. And so how do we find a way around this, in convincing those that we think there should be an alternative way of teaching, an alternative way of working in our field. Well, that's pretty impossible because that threatens those in power, because they know they can't do it because it's not what they do. And, I mean, honestly, Marla, when you talk about not hearing about the Frankfurt School or not really having it embedded, I mean, most students now, most doctoral students don't have Dewey.
Right.
And that to me is almost like Sesame Street of philosophy compared to, Frankfurt School. And no insult to Dewey. I think he was one of the greatest, scholars of our time, well, of our parents' time. But it's that idea that we're not even doing the accessible, let alone what is often very intellectually inaccessible.
So
It's
Shirley,
funny. Oh, go ahead.
I was curious. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I don't know very much about like who you studied with. Like when you went to, where did you go to school? Who did you study with? Who influenced you? I don't really know very much about that.
By mistake, I was educated. I was, I lived in Southern Alberta. I'm from LA. Lived in Southern Alberta because my first husband is Canadian, and I went to finish my 15-year attempt to get my bachelor's, and I finished it up in a town called Lethbridge in Alberta, right above Montana, and then kind of decided that I just wasn't happy in my marriage. I had 4 kids, married to a Mormon in a small little town. I loved the town. I loved the people, loved everything about it, but I did not want to be I did not want to have to grow old in this religious environment that I was not, interested in. And I was just kind of ready to go. So I left him and moved to a town, to Lethbridge, and went and and I was a high school teacher for a year, a high school drama teacher. And the first day of class was 7:10 in the morning, my first drama class. And I stood there and realized that I can't do this the rest of my life. I'll go back to university and get a master's and PhD because I can't get up this early in the morning. That's how deeply intellectual I am. And so I literally did. I got into the school at Lethbridge, the master's degree. Now in my bachelor's, there's a woman called Julia Ellis who was there, and she was my professor, and she taught creative problem solving for gifted kids. And I was very intrigued by her work, and I really liked her. And she didn't like to travel. She's from Thunder Bay, Ontario, now out here, and she just didn't like to travel. So she would send me all over to do these gigs with high schools. So that's kind of how I'd always been a speaker. I'd been in speech and debate as a kid, but she sent me all over to go to districts and things to work on these creative problem solving, which basically now I see as improvisational theater, only doing it on paper. And Julie's boyfriend was a guy called David Smith, and he was there with us, David Jeffrey Smith. And his best friend was David Jardine. And they were U of A people. But David Smith was with me, and he became my master's teacher. So Julie was kind of my bachelor's person, and David was my master's person. And the first year I had left my husband, Julie said, there's this conference you need to go with to me. This is 1989. And she said, I've got money, I can fund you. Let's go to this place in Dayton, Ohio. I'm like, I'm an American. I'm from the East Coast originally. Like nobody goes to Dayton, Ohio. But it was like, okay, it's a free trip. It sounds fun. And I went with Julie to Dayton, Ohio. And my life was changed for the rest of my life because I fell in love with and met and fell in love with Joe Kinchelow in Dayton, Ohio. And I didn't see much of Julie that entire conference. Anyhow, the next semester, just then, that semester, I just started a course with David Smith. And he opened the course by showing a film called Starting from Nina. And it was a story that was a film that was made in 1970 in Toronto with Paulo Freire when he had gone there to work with immigrant kids from Portugal. And I just was in love with this. And then the next week, another course assigned me Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So at the same time, I'd met Joe and I knew about Paulo, but this was so much bigger, and I became totally engaged. And then by January that year, David Smith was just one of the smartest writers. You must know David.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. One of the smartest writers, and just a very self-effacing, funny guy, raised in China, just a weird person, but fabulous. But he truly taught me a lot. And so that was my genealogy. And then there was a woman called Kathleen Berry, who was at University of New Brunswick, who came to Lethbridge, and she taught me about improvisational teaching, how to really teach in a off the wall kind of way. So all these people, just the three of them, were like my trinity of affecting me. And meanwhile, I was falling more and more in love with Joe Kincheloe, who was absolutely over the top, had originally started in the Reconceptualist era, but found very quickly that it was not political enough, nor I think we both, I saw it this way. I don't like to speak for Joe, but since he's dead, I guess I can. We both thought there was a self-indulgence in the Reconceptualist movement that was quite annoying in a lot of ways. And there was a lot of preciousness about it. Indeed, I find the left in academics is precious most of the time. There's not a lot of laughter, a lot of teasing. There's not a lot of silliness. It's all, it's kind of like, it reminds me when I've been in Germany and go to a beer place next to a university, all the long bearded men with the 10,000 cigarettes and pipes leaning over their bottle of beer and screaming at each other for hours. I mean, that hasn't changed. That's still a kind of group of people. And that's kind of, in a sense, a metaphor of how I saw the academic left in a lot of ways. Like, get over yourself. You can just really be funny sometimes. Sometimes the world is so absurd that we just have to laugh at it. And Joe, because you both know Joe, and probably most people who watch this will have known Joe, he laughed. He was the loudest, biggest laugher in the world. Everything was funny and he imitated them, yet he was such a fine scholar. And I just do think that that's important. So that year from 89 to 90, that entire year was one of the most seminal years it was the most seminal year of my life. And then right after that, we had been to something, and Donaldo Macedo calls Joe up in the middle of nowhere, South Carolina, where we were, another Jew in the South. And he said, if you can come to Boston, I want you to meet Paulo Freire. And we had no money. And I think I bought stuff on a credit card and then returned it for cash and got us the cash to go to Boston. And that's how we met Paulo. And so there's my genealogy right there. It's Julie Ellis, then David Smith, Kathy Berry, Kincheloe always, and then and Donaldo's accessibility to Paulo. And then very soon after that, we were invited to Miami, or he was invited to Miami of Ohio to give a speech. And he knew Peter McLaren, but not well. And we went up to see Peter and his amazing partner then, Jenny, who, is just the most loving, caring person in the world. And of course, Joe and Peter laughed the entire time. I mean, I thought I'd be sitting around listening to, highbrow Marxists yelling and screaming, and all I did was listen and laugh and be weird. And then walking down the hallway, we ran into Henry Giroux, who Joe had known a little bit. And so that added to my genealogy. And in Bergamo, there was a couple of women I fell in love with from afar. I fell in love with Joanne Pagano. I thought she was one of the most amazing speakers and one of the smartest women I had ever met. And I went on for many years to be a good friend of hers. We've lost touch. We're still on Facebook, but her work in early pedagogy was amazing. And the other person I fell in love with was Deborah Britzman. And I just, I sat and talked to Joanne a bit. Britzman and I didn't talk at that time, but I was like a little girl stage struck by knowing this woman knew everything. And I was very impressed with her. So those two women were very, very seminal in their early writings to me. And then Patty Lather. And Patty, very, very committed scholar, but she's another one who's just funny as can be. And when you got people like that around Kinchlow, everything was just loud laughing most of the time. In fact, I don't remember ever very much being around Marla and Mary and Joe and not having lots of loud laughter. Because, and so I do believe, I guess that's part of my pedagogy, is that laughter and humor has to be very, very strong. And that's something that I think a lot of serious scholars need to learn. I think that, and with, you know, looking at Freire's work, his notion of humility, that laughter and humility add up to making us better people. I'm talking really a lot, sorry.
That's what you're
No,
saying.
it's good.
We're interviewing you.
It's really interesting, and that's why, you know, we want to listen to you and learn your story, because I didn't know any of that. I mean, that was really fascinating. I didn't know any of that, and
I didn't know the connection with David Smith. I've known David Smith forever. And
Well,
David Jardine. Yeah.
this notion of genealogy makes a difference, because the other one of the other things I do with my students after they write that autobiography, I always give them a restriction. I don't say write your story. So if it's a literacy class, I want to hear their literacy story. I want to know, how did reading and writing and language help shape them? If so, I always would do that in that regard. So, and it's an education class always. So I want them to tell me how they were educated. If you're a reader, how were you, you know, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And so what I found is that in all the autobiographies, almost all, and in my autobiography, which was the first publication I ever did, was in a book called 13 Questions. In that autobiography, I rediscovered that really the most important person in my life and why I was where I was my school teacher. And so if that's the case, and what I would do is, now I just finished reading about 30 of them for 2 courses I'm teaching. And in all 30 of them, they talk about their seminal school teacher, whether the worst or the best. And so my challenge to them after that exercise is, if you have noted someone who made a real difference in your life, I challenge you to reach out and tell them, hey, you are part of the reason that I am becoming a professor, or that I am becoming a school teacher. And I did that because I've done it with David Smith, I've done it with Julia Ellis, and I thought that that was very important. And I always, when I write for, you know, like, I always note the genealogy in a lot of ways. Like, if I have to write, I had to write a forward or something for a book for Giroux. And it was finally my time to give back, because I could tell what I wanted to say, but I could say, this guy is more than just what you think. This is the person he is, you know? And I just think that giving back is really important. And giving back is part of humility, letting someone else know who affected them, who made a difference for them.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I don't know if you know this magazine. It's called Philosophy Now. It comes out of England. It's kind of a pop, philosophy magazine. But I wrote a piece about a professor I had at Tulane named Andrew Reck, and it was all about walking into his classroom, and he was at that time he seemed very old to me. I don't know how old he was, but when you're young, everybody's old, right? But he would shuffle in because he had back problems, and he would bring in these old yellow, torn up notes on paper that were like, I never saw anybody so old fashioned. I just fell in love with his classes, and I was like, who is this guy? Wow. I mean, he really changed my life. I wanted to become a professor because of him, and that was as an undergraduate. So I wrote this piece for this Philosophy Now journal, and at first they turned it down. They said, "Oh, who cares about him?" I said, "You have missed the whole point." And so I had to argue with them, and they go, "Oh, you're right. We have missed the whole point. This is jolly good." And then they published it. But it's about time and memory. And I did try to get in touch with him, but I had no luck doing so. He's probably in his mid-90s now, and I can't. I asked people at Tulane, and they didn't answer me. So, but yes, I feel the same way. I mean, gratitude and humility and looking back to see, and thanking people. I mean, that's a lost art, to say thank you.
It is. And I think it does make a difference. It does. In fact, there was one line in an essay yesterday I was reading from one of my students' autobiography, and she said, I never thought of doing this. And she talked about writing, and she said, what I find that I'm taking from me as I write this, she's a pre-service teacher, is that will there ever be a day that someone writes about me being a good teacher who made a difference? And I thought that was, it wasn't egocentric. It was just such a nice musing that can we all be that person? And I just liked it. I liked the way it made teaching so important.
A link in a chain, people influence you, you pass it on into the future.
Exactly. And that is what genealogy does.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is, and we know what the world is like, and not all people are affected by their caregivers. Not all people have parents, so we don't know what their etymology is, but we do know what our conscious past is because we see how we were constructed.
Mm-hmm.
So what are you working on these days? What are you thinking about in the future?
Well, I'm if I get asked to do another COVID article, I'm going to scream. It's like, why? We get it, and now we're to the point that we don't know if this thing is, if it's going to end and when. So I don't like this new normal business. And so right now I'm writing a piece called I don't want normal, I want better. And the idea that what is it we miss so much? Everything was pretty sucky when it comes to education. I mean, I don't think we've missed much. I really don't. I just don't miss normal. I mean, I miss going out and spending so much money. I mean, we save money now. That's kind of cool. I miss seeing friends. I miss, a few things, hugging people. I miss my students' physicality, but I don't want anything in education to come back. Nothing. There's not one thing I want to come back. What? So we can in Canada read To Kill a Mockingbird again for the 60th year? I mean, so we can do 3 Hamlet, or we could do 3 Shakespearean plays, but never know one Canadian play or one famous American play. I'm sorry. I'm sick of the curriculum. I'm sick of how kids are taught. I'm sick that they're taught their exam course. All courses are based on exams, period. I'm sick of large class sizes. I think education sucks.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know my son, that time period when they were kicked out of school at March, and then there were no tests at the end of the year. That was one of the best educational experiences he had during that time, because teachers had to make up their own stuff and not listen to what the mandates were.
Right. And if the mandates weren't what they wanted to do, they did what they want. What are you gonna do? Come into my house and look at what I'm teaching? Right. And I just love it. So I'm doing that. I'm angry and sick of the new normal. I don't want normal. I just want better. And then the other thing is I'm doing media literacy. Nice to see, Dan, that you have my book on your shelf. How bizarre. Did you just put it up there? You got it out of the garbage or something?
Not at all. That's my media section over there.
But I'm still,
I didn't think of it.
I'm still love media. And I'm hoping we get through this entire interview without mentioning Voldemort's name. But what I found in the other Voldemort, but what I found is that if ever Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman, Doug Kellner, me, Rhonda Hammer, people like that who talked about media, if ever we were onto something, and of course the great Chomsky and Stuart Hall, I believe that if we do not pay attention to media now, we will go down the drain. But that to be able to discern and understand media, schools don't even have media literacy in their curriculum. It's crazy. It's like you can get rid of algebra, get rid of geometry, get rid of all science. I don't care, get rid of everything, but you've got to teach media literacy. I really believe that it's that important of an understanding. And that's right, left, both equally.
Absolutely. But what they're doing now is that they're censoring more. And I see people on the left cheering this on. And to me, it's super dangerous, because that's going to turn left in a heartbeat. It already has, to groups like, the World Socialist Network and things like that.
And
Um,
that's terrifying, because
Terrifying.
that and they're not listening to themselves, that they're acquiring. It's like the right has become left and the left has become right. The right learned to drop words like disenfranchisement, marginalized, like they cared. And
Mhm.
then the left is now appropriating this right-wing conservative viewpoint of the way things should be.
That's right. That's right. You have to stay in this box. You have to speak what's normal. And if you don't, you're going to be out. You're going to be deplatformed. You're going to be canceled. You're going to be, um,
Yeah,
censored.
and this cancel thing, I'm so sick of that word.
Well,
I mean, like, first of all, cancel.
right.
Cancel means you have something and then you get rid of it. Most of the stuff that's canceled, nobody wanted in the first place. I'm so tired of buzzwords. I'm so tired of
Mm.
just nothing meaning. It's like we are in a Brechtian play. We are in Ionesco. We are in theater of the absurd, where up is down and down is sideways. And I don't know what's going to happen. And, being in Canada, it is better. I don't like saying it, but it is. It is a socialist-ish country, enough that people who want to own businesses can and be in charge of their own lives, but enough to know that you will never starve, you will never hurt for health, and you will always have a roof over your head. We also have a mandated constitutional law on hate speech. Now, that to me, in addressing what you had to say, Dan, that is a huge difference,
Mhm.
because freedom of speech should imply responsible speech.
Mm.
But when it's irresponsible, how can we say that should be allowed?
Mm.
And to be having this debate is honestly absurd. It really is. But we did have freedom of speech in Canada, and then this guy in Alberta, where I live, Jim Keekstra, was a grade 8 teacher and taught that the Holocaust didn't exist. And it took years for someone to finally pay attention to it. And after that, and after different things that were happening in the world, they came up with this notion of hate speech as a crime.
Mhm. When was that?
Maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago.
Interesting.
So I just think hate, I think that's such a simple little amendment, you
Right.
know. But now I'm listening to the absurdity that is this trial in the Senate. And when someone says go kill, go destroy, go blow up, go attack, and then to say, but that's free speech, no,
Right.
that's inflammatory. And I think this happened in the Nuremberg trials. I think that the Geneva Convention noted that people were committing crimes if they caused war or pestilence or murder or death.
And actually, the impeachment hearing has nothing to do with whether he committed a crime or not. It has to do with whether he can hold office or not again. And so it's a different kind of level of, you know, judgment there. I mean, if he said, I don't believe in the Constitution and I'm going to throw it away, well, he's free to say it criminally, but he's not free to say it as a government official or as a president. And that's what the impeachment is trying to show.
It is. And it's just, and then this notion of symbolism, like this stupid
Mhm.
flag, a piece of cloth now is something so important, and like you can be convicted for hurting the flag, but it's just so silly,
Right.
and then this notion of, and I just listening today because they had this 10-mile long opening prayer. Like, I'm sorry, but I kind of thought in a grade 8 civics, which of course they don't have anymore in the United States, I do believe that we were taught that it was separation of church and state, but I sure haven't seen that in probably 30 years.
No, everyone bends their knee at that. Everyone, every
Well, and Reagan was the one who really brought it in. I mean, your boy Carter, as religious as he was, didn't impose that on the presidency, but that
No.
was Ronald Reagan coming in and linking hands with all his Irish relatives and thanking God for something. And all of a sudden, you know, in this prayer breakfast, I mean, it's all very creepy.
So when you said the Frankfurt School is part of your genealogy, you mean ideologically, or or do you mean religiously because most of them were Jewish, or do you mean that you can actually link some of your professors back to them?
Oh, well, Jewishly, I mean, come on, you know, it's a small group of people. So when you can find a landsman, then you're good. And so you know, Marla and I were in love with each other just probably because we were the only Jews at the same conference. Now there was one or two others there, you know, but you know that, I mean, and I have to say our Jewishness has always brought us together, besides that we like each other. But and same as with Deborah Britzman. I mean, it just is. And I think people do search for people they're, you know, like, or that they can talk to. But I don't really, I am culturally Jew straightforward. I, I, you know, I don't know if I just don't care if there's a God. I'm not agnostic, I'm not atheist. I just am respectful. If other people care, just get it out of my space. But I just think it's so funny, this mythology. I'm always astounded. My daughter's daughter is 17, and she was sitting in English class last semester, and they read this piece uh, on Christianity, and it used Mary as a metaphor. And the teacher asked her to make a comment. Where was she on this? And she made this comment. I wish I had it written down, but it was so great. She just said, I just don't understand the conversation about this woman. She was a girl. She was smart enough to realize she got pregnant. And so she makes up this ridiculous story about having the Son of God. And she said, what a scam. And my daughter called me. My daughter was just so upset because my daughter is not, she is a Christian, not a religious Christian, but she is Christian. And my daughter called up and said she'd given birth to mini Shirley. And I thought it was so funny because I thought, you know, this has been a long time that I've thought of anything religiously that makes total sense. And I don't know why I didn't think of that. But the idea that we can sit and I can see brilliant scholars. I can think of critical pedagogy, reconceptualist geniuses at University of Utah and who are involved in the Mormon faith. And I just think, how can they know this stuff and be so brilliant? And they believe that their heavenly Father is taking care of them, and that everything that happens, he has his hand in, and that Mary gave birth to his. I mean, it's just, I'm sorry. And if you're insulted, get a life. But I just feel like, how can you believe this and be a grown-up? How can you be an adult? You know, I mean, my stepfather was Italian Catholic, and we would go see his mom, who was my only grandmother that I really was raised around, and she had an altar in her bedroom, and it had, you know, all the saints and of all her kids and candles. I mean, it was like a fire trap, and it like twice or three times a day she'd go get on her knees and she'd have the beads, and it's just like, seriously? I mean, really? Do we need this stuff? And I just don't, I hate it. I hate any kind of large building that's built to respect a deity who's not there most of the time. I just have a real problem. I mean, we have homeless people and they're sleeping on the streets, but y'all can have this building that's empty except for Sunday morning. I mean, where did I get into religion? I don't like religion very much.
I think I asked you about the Frankfurt School and
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm a Jewish woman. That's how I identify myself. I'm a Jewish woman. I guess I'm an S because I'm not a she because I'm not a he. But I don't know why I have to indicate that, because if you're talking to me, you're not going to use my pronoun anyhow. So that annoys me. And I just, yes, I like Jews. I like them a lot. I mean, I'm with a Jew. I've been with him for 3 years after being with 3 husbands that were all from Christian backgrounds. I was at my therapist's 3.5 years ago, and she said, "Tell me what you really want in life." I said, "I want to meet a Jewish man and I want to live in New York." And so I went home and thought about that. And the next week, I called a friend. I subletted his apartment. I moved to New York, got a New York phone number, and I was still going to fly all the time back and forth. And I got on Tinder, and I only dated Jewish men. And within 6 weeks, I'd fallen in love with a Jewish man. Now, he's as unreligious as I am,
Right.
although he thinks I tempt God a little too much. But yeah, and so the Frankfurt School is important to me. Not all of it, because I don't know all the guys. I just know the biggies. I love the person who probably is more significant, and this is exciting. It's once again the coincidence. Is Antonio Gramsci.
Mm.
I just this was an amazing little man who was crippled and small and disfigured, died very young, and he was thrust into Mussolini's prisons. His first time was in Turin, where he was in the prison there. It was a prison for anti-fascists. It's still there. It's called the Prison of Anti-Fascists. And I was so influenced by this funny Italian Jewish guy and all his work. And he wasn't really part of the Frankfurt School, but he is Frankfurt School, if that makes sense. And my funny, weird coincidence is the other day, because I have to spend some money. Very good book. I had to spend some money. So I bought this huge 3-volume set of the prison notebooks. Now, this is very interesting. I'm getting to a point. So the prison notebooks he wrote as he watched Mussolini's prisons. And this is how he really came up with the understanding, more than anyone, of how power works, the panopticon of power. Mm-hmm. And he really made a difference in my life and in that of many theorists. Anyhow, so I buy this, and I'm not thinking about anything much. I buy it, and the bloody book is edited by Joe Buttigieg. Now, I knew that Pete Buttigieg's dad was a critical theorist, and he's a Maltese. They're from Malta. This is by Pete Buttigieg's dad.
Hilarious.
Is that not cool?
Yeah.
So that was my exciting thing. And then Theodore Adorno, who was part of the Frankfurt School. I don't think he was a Jew. Maybe he was. I can't remember. But Adorno left, after they got out of the UK allowed men of them. Oh, you got Adorno. After they got out of Germany, they settled in different places, and they all had interesting stories, and I don't know them all. And Joe actually wrote a song about the critical theory school. Joe wrote a song about everything. But I had talked often about would love to see a movie or a doc on these guys and being there and how they got out. Anyhow, the UK, as much as the anti-Semitic Churchill and the Windsors were, they did let some Jews out. And a lot went to the UK and a lot went to the United States. Adorno went to, where does a critical theorist go? Well, we go to the Bay Area, of course. And Adorno started doing his stuff up there. And he was giving a lecture, and I think it might have been at Stanford. I don't know if that story's true, or if that's true. I know the story's pretty true. But he was giving a lecture, and he was, everybody was so in awe of Theodore Adorno finally, getting there, the philosophy people. And this woman, for some reason, this girl came up and saw him and pulled her shirt up, and she was totally naked and flashed him. And evidently it was incredibly traumatic to this very pompous, self-satisfied person. Now, Adorno did go on to kill himself, and I don't know if it was the woman's breasts who caused it, but it is an interesting story. But there are so many cool stories about these weird men too. It's just a very interesting group of quirky people.
That's a good one. I never heard that one.
I never heard that either.
But I think they are very interesting. And I wish I was as smart as an eighth as smart as any of them. But they did it, for what I do understand of their stuff, I do, I do like it. And then going on to with Benjamin, I mean, he was so seminal in creating the consciousness for culture. And we all have dabbled or dipped into cultural studies now in our work. And indeed, I wonder, how did we write what we wrote before we were introduced to cultural studies? And that part of that genealogy is Larry Grossberg for me, North Carolina, and his work, his original work, and Stanley Aronowitz. Now, they are Jewish. Am I meant to only have a Jewish genealogy? Well, Paula was a religious Catholic, so I can say not particularly, but I do think I have been affected. And maybe it's the lack of God in their work that I like, that I don't have to climb through that stuff, and I just get to what I see, the nuts and bolts of culture there. But I've written a book called Christotainment, I looking at fundamentalist Christianity and how it affects culture. And I'm very interested in it kind of as a kitsch, kind of quirky niche.
Shirley, do you know Philip Wexler?
Very well. He's a very close friend. His work in social psychology was also a very important piece of work. Phil's been in Israel for a long time. I think he's now retired at the Finger Lakes, trying to write more. But I think Phil's a quirky guy, and he's very much unto himself. He actually was the dean when Pinar was at Rochester, and he has lots of stories about Pinar and his Zen shaved head stage. He worked in bringing together the notion of sociology and psychology, and the social theory, like really forcing social theory into psychology. So he's really very smart. I don't think as many people know his work anymore. I don't know. Dan, do you know his stuff?
Well, I know his stuff, but I read it, decades ago or a decade ago.
But he really, looking at the Frankfurt School and looking at Giroux, looking at Freire, they all gave me significant stuff. And I guess the big word, if I could say I could only have one word for my pedagogy, it would be contextualization. Like, if you don't contextualize it, it don't matter. And social psychology basically said, if you do not look at the social context of how things work, you don't know anything. Right. You've got to look at that. And I have learned to use it. If you're listening to this and love psychology, and then you should be reading Wexler and Britzman, because they are in our field in a meta sense, but they have gone into the notion of psychology in a very important way.
Well, I have a strange story. Okay, so I met Philip one time. I interviewed at the U of R, and he was dean. And that was my extent of being at the U of R. I guess I didn't get that job, but the minute I met him, I thought, oh my God, who is this guy, right? I mean, all he talked about was books, books, books. Read this, read this, read this, read this. And he said that he was interested in Gershom Scholem. Well, Gershom Scholem was at Hebrew University, and he wrote the most famous book on Kabbalah. And I know that Philip went to Hebrew University. I don't know if he knew him or knew of him, or he was dead by the time he got there or whatever. But Gershom Scholem was in the conversation. Well, Gershom Scholem was also friends with Walter Benjamin. You see the genealogy here? And I'm like, oh, is this weird or what? Because I kept reading about Benjamin and Scholem, thinking, is that the same Scholem that Philip Wexler was talking about at Hebrew? Yeah, it's the same one. And so it's just very, very, very small world, actually. And it all kind of, this genealogy stuff is very strange.
That really is. I believe he was a friend. He didn't work with Scholem, but I think he may have met him. Philip is very, he's not religious, but very conscious of religiosity and very much a believer in the Jewish, not so much mysticism, but philosophical Jewish. It is very interesting, and that is a very interesting genealogy.
Mm.
He may be, if I'm book learning, he must be the smartest person I've ever known in my life.
Yeah. Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
I would say socially, absolutely not. I would say Kinchelo is maybe the most socially aware, socially contextual, socio-active, socio-cultural person I ever knew.
Mhm.
Mm.
Mhm.
And, but I just, yeah, Philip, I like thinking about, I just heard from him the other day. We write occasionally. He's done a book, he did a book with me years and years ago. And he and I, we were at a conference with Kinchelo, and for some reason, Joe was doing something. We were in Germany, and Philip introduced me to my dearest German friends that I'm friends with still today, and that I've written with, and and we would have many, many discussions, spent a lot of time in Germany, and especially about the Holocaust conversations. But Phil and I spent a day at Buchenwald, and that was really pinnacle because of so many of the camps. There's very significant research done there on, and horrible things done there. And Philip and I just remember, and I write about it probably in the intro to his book, I think. Either his book, I think it was his book. And I remember just walking up and down the mounds and going and sitting and talking in this. It seemed like I have never been to a camp, and my big penance to being in Germany would always be to visit a camp every time I was in Germany. So I've seen, most of the German camps. But Philip and I both agreed that we had never been to a camp, that the weather wasn't freezing cold and dismal. So I remember our coats blowing in this freezing cold wind.
It, I can't even get the words out. When I met him, it was 2000 when I interviewed, and he was talking about a trip, and maybe it was with you because he'd known I wrote my dissertation on the Holocaust, and he said he'd been to a camp, and I asked him, I said, well, what was that like? And he just paused, and like, this is one of those moments in your mind like you never forget. He paused, and he just changed, and he said, what was it like? And then he didn't say anything after that. And it was just,
That's
it was
Mm.
so incredible. It was an incredible moment for me. Philip is an amazing person. I mean, I met him for what, a total of half an hour. And it's like, I never, it was a whirlwind of a mind, but that comment, and he must have been there with you. And I didn't
You
know.
know what? He probably was. And I had been to other camps. Actually, I think I wrote that piece in Svi Shapiro's book, Strangers in the Land. I
Mhm.
talked about going with Philip. There's something about being at a camp with someone. I had gone to my first camp. I was traveling in Europe alone, and I'd gone to Dachau because I was near Munich. And it was a really weird experience because it was hard to get there. I'd heard it's just a few minutes outside of Munich, but I would go to train stations. So this is in the 80s. I would go to train stations. They wouldn't tell me how to get there. Like I'd say, I'd like to go to Dachau. Well, we don't know. It was like, so I finally had to
Oh,
go
they
to a
wanted it
hotel.
hidden.
Huh?
They wanted it difficult. They
Yeah.
wanted to
In,
put up an
in the
obstacle.
80s, and in the 80s, that was still the mentality.
Right.
And so I finally got there and went, and I was alone. And have you been to Dachau, either of you?
Mm-mm.
It's very preserved, and so you see the experiments and you read, and it's just when you walk and just see that Arbeit macht frei over it's just, you don't know how you're going to feel until you feel it. And I remember being alone, and I thought it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever done. And all the laughing, giggling German school kids running around looking for cokes, doing what kids do. It was very, very complicated. And I remember sitting in a gutter with my feet over by the sewer, like on a street, and just, I cried, and I was so lonely. So I decided I would never go alone again to a camp. And it's pretty horrible. It's kind of, it reminds me of being here in Alberta. And I just made a film. Oh, that's my other thing I'm doing is I do a lot of filmmaking. I just made a film on a reservation. In Canada, we call it a reserve. On working with a high school student and her grandpa. And I just finished this film. And it was, when I do film, I do let them do, they just do narrative and they can go anywhere they want. And where this grandfather took me, I didn't expect it, was he had been a residential school survivor. And so he told his story. And so right when the film came out, the premier of Alberta, who's a right-wing munchkin, his secretary stated that they don't want to teach about residential schools because they're not sure they ever really happened. And I had just made this film with a survivor. And it ties me back into what I was saying about Kijkstra and teaching kids that the Holocaust never happened. The idea of depriving people of their memory and of their knowledges, the social psychology involved into decontextualizing people's reality is really a horrendous crime. It's horrible. And I worry about that in our kids' curriculum every day, how much decontextualization we do morning, noon, and night in education.
Absolutely. Everything's decontextualized.
It's all hanging. It's like
bits of data.
Bits of dust and data. Yep.
Not
it is.
To anything.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, your story. I mean, I haven't been to a camp. Just in the last couple of years, did I learn about where my family is from, my dad's side.
Where?
Outside of Kiev, there was a farming community that, like Fiddler on the Roof, right? Kind of stuck in the pale somewhere, where the Tsar told him to be, and left late 19th century, during the time that there were a lot of pogroms that the Tsar was murdered and it was blamed on Jewish people. And so my ancestors came over and took the name Chapman. It wasn't Chapman, it was Chipanuk or something like that, or Chipanuk. I mean, I don't know how to pronounce it. I know how it's spelled in English. I don't even know how it's spelled in Cyrillic. So, it's interesting. But after travel is once again a thing, I do plan on going there. And I haven't been to a camp, and during that trip.
It's worth it. So you're Ukraine.
Well, on my dad's side, it's Ukraine and Poland, and then on my mom's side, it's Hungary. And
yeah,
my mom's side was wiped out by the Holocaust.
Wow. That's interesting. I mean, it's always and Poland with Eastern European Jews, because Russia and Poland, the borders were switched all the time. So when it was part of Poland, then it wasn't part of Russia. My family's from, we're Litvaks, so we're basically came from Lithuania. What's interesting is that I tried to get, I wanted to get Lithuanian citizenship because it's an EU. I would have an EU passport. And there was 11 years in the time where my family was born that it was Russian. So they said, they were all excited, and there's this whole Lithuanian group that gets new citizens, but I could become a Russian, but not a Lithuanian. I took, for the first time, it was the best money I ever spent. I took my daughter and her daughter and my other daughter, and then a friend and her daughter, all women, and we just did trains. We flew into Warsaw and we went all the way down to Hungary and back. And just, it was kind of what we needed to do. It was a way to show our daughters and our granddaughters who we were. It was really important, really important. And I'm really glad I did it. And now I actually got back into genealogy. I actually am a member of the Mormon site of all things, but they are the best genealogists in the world.
Right.
And I have this huge family tree. I've gone down three generations of my, of the Steinbergs. It's pretty exciting. When you start getting into the early 1800s, it almost legitimates where you are, you know. It's very interesting. So you need to do it when this lifts.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe I'll take Marla with me so I'm not alone.
I
I've been to Germany and Austria, and did not have a good time.
I'm always very uncomfortable. It's funny, they are beautiful countries and I'm always uncomfortable. And you know, there's no reason to not be. David, who's a hysterical disaster person, he disasterizes a lot, like most of us do in our culture. He always says, you know, just once they get rid of Blanc and Blanc, they always come for the Jews. And this last 4 years reign, this Fourth Reich in the United States by a German immigrant, German Nazi extraction president, has really made us realize that, you know, every time something's wrong, there is, you know, it's not saying that they're not blaming blacks or LGBTQ people, or, you know, there's lots of marginalized people in the world, but when you're in that marginalized place, you know, you're screwed, you know, in a lot of ways. And then, you know, it's like the marginalizational, you know, piles on, like, you know, in the life of marginalized disenfranchisement, Dan is the safest because he's a white male, and then I'm the second safest because I don't identify in LGBTQ, and then Marla's the least safe. So now Marla would have to, the next person would have to be a person of color or disabled to be more marginalized than we are. So it's very interesting to look at the degrees of marginalization that we all carry with us.
But it's interesting, you know, Dan and I have had this conversation, like, we're not seen as marginalized here, you know, in the South.
Well, depends on if, do they even know what a Jew is?
No.
You know, I say I'm Jewish and they say, oh, you're white. And then I say, okay, let me go my white power meeting. And then they say, you're not white. You know, so, you know, it's like,
don't you ever get y'all killed our lard.
Lard meaning two things, right?
I hope this insults someone out there.
Oh, this has been great fun, Shirley. It's great talking with you.
Yeah.
I miss you. I miss seeing you guys. This is really funny.
Yeah, I mean, this is great. We should have coffee houses, you know, and
right.
stuff like that.
So I do have a couple more questions if you don't mind, or you.
No, not at all.
Okay. So like something that you said earlier was like to do the genealogy of the left, as if there was a right in our field. And like at this point, I don't really like, back then, was it more contentious when you were coming in? Because right now I see a lot of agreement, and if you do disagree with someone, then that's a problem. But I don't know if there was more debating and more contentiousness, like healthy contentiousness.
Yeah, it wasn't even contentious. I mean, between Henry and Bill, you know, and Michael, and I don't even know what it is, you know, it might be just an alpha thing. But honestly, I can manage to like everybody, and I'm not that much of a nice guy, but you know, I do think it might be gender based. As far as I think there is and there isn't. I think maybe the people that would cause more problems are older now. Like, I'm older and I know how to not make stupid remarks about positionality. I frankly think it's stupid. I think positionality as far as ethnic, racial, gender, sexuality. I'm sorry, that is part of who we are, but there's more important things to me, and that's, do we want people to live? Do we want the planet to survive? I mean, I have bigger fish to fry than worrying about how I'm called and what you're called. And if you want to be called something, that's just fine. But if I forget, tough. Sorry. I've known you for 40 years. You've been a man. Now you want me to, I'm sorry. I don't remember stuff. I'm old. So I just fall back on age, number one. But I think we can get precious about positionality. We really can be precious about how we're treated. And give me a break. Just get over it. And like, there's pettiness. I'll give you a pettiness example. Went to a Zoom, because that's what we do of our faculty. That's what I've learned, is that in times of COVID, you can't get out of faculty meetings because everybody knows you can be there. So we have 200, 300 people. We're all waiting. And so it's about 30 minutes, 20 minutes before. So I tuned on early to look wonderful, basically, so I could leave early. And so a bunch of us are talking, probably about 40 women laughing, and talking. And somebody says, I'm going to dye I should dye my hair. Oh, my dean, I think. She says, we should dye, I need to dye my hair, but I've decided I'm going to go white. I said, oh, don't do that. There's nothing more obnoxious than these bougie women with long hair down their back that's white and wearing their Birkenstocks, walking around being little Miss Flower Child at 65 years old. I said, color your hair. Why do you want to look old? And so we're having this conversation and laughing, and everybody's laughing, telling hair stories, and just, riotous, finally having fun, because we don't really know each other that well, because we don't talk, we're busy. So it was fun. So anyhow, a day later, I get a 4-paragraph letter from this nobody's woman that I've never met in my life, professor, who said how I offended her. And there are those of us who, and I don't know what. I don't know what was her hair gray. I don't know. And she writes me this BS letter. So, and I thought, I have a problem with this. So I wrote back and I just said 2 questions. Have you written this to anyone else? And did you know I was Jewish? Because I always fall back on that. And so she writes back, and evidently she's Jewish too. But she said, yes, I wrote it to everyone. So now I'm finding out that she wrote like 20 letters like this, calling us out for insulting her. And I just wrote, in the middle of a deadly virus, you have the audacity to get mad at me because I said something about gray hair. And I said, never bother me again. And I just sent it to her. And I just thought, what pettiness, what stupidity. And is that what we've brought ourselves to in political correctness? I mean, Bill Maher is correct in a lot of ways when he makes fun of political correctness. He says, I can't commit to the right, makes me sick, but I can't commit to the left because they're so steeped in this notion of political correctness. And it's like, should we not look at it at intent? Like if we look at murder or manslaughter or accidental, if I just bump into you and you die, that's accidental. If I by mistake cause your death, that's manslaughter. And if I stab you to death, it's murder. Each has a different charge. But on the left, we look at everything as murder. If somebody makes a little tiny mistake, who cares who cares? Who cares if little insults happen? I mean, I'm not going to purposely go and insult an entire community of marginalized people, but sometimes we can't just be precious all the time. Sometimes the ecology of the world is more important. And I had to go through this for the first 10 years in my career because of all the pissed off women, because they were all angry that only men were critical pedagogues. Well, you know what? If you like it, suck it up and become one yourself. But when I can only still name about 5 or 6 leading women in critical pedagogy, that's a problem. But that's not my problem, and it's not the men's problem. It's the problem that women, what, are they not academic themselves enough? Do they not want to write the hard stuff? What's the problem? Why are you not writing in critical pedagogy? And so to me, you can't be mad at somebody for something that's your own fault. Let's move on, take the best, do it, and make education better. If we were doing critical pedagogy in the schools, probably more women would become professors in critical pedagogy.
Mm.
And maybe if you're such a critical critiquer, then maybe you need to write 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 books on the field, and maybe you'll get acknowledged too. So it really upsets me. That's why positionality and essentialism, I understand marginalization. What has happened to the North America for Black, brown, and red people in this virus is probably the worst oppressive situations that has ever occurred globally. I believe that. I will fight against anyone who is going to disenfranchise someone because of their race, class, gender, sexuality. But I'm not going to disenfranchise them if they are not responsible. And, it's just, Dan, it goes back to what you said. You're still considered white. Well, so are Marla and I. And if we walk into Walmart, probably none of us three are going to be followed and somebody looking to say, why do we have a bulge in our jacket? We can walk into Walmart, should we decide to ever want to shop at that redneck piece of crap store. We can walk in and
Right.
we can put stuffing in our pocket and no one will ever catch us. But if we're Black or brown or read in a certain way, we're going to get followed. Now, that's white privilege. We may not belong to it if we're marching into an oven or into a shower in Germany,
Right.
but we are fluid in our positionality as white people.
That's
Some
right.
people aren't. But to say that there's something, it's like after the Holocaust, we're not screaming for every Jew to be hired. It's just, you can't do that. That's not appropriate. And so I do hate political correctness. I really do. I want to be politically inoffensive. I don't want to hurt someone's feeling. And I want to say, hey, I'm just in the middle of a fight now because I'm on a committee with 3 women and 16 men. And yet our school just passed an equity law. So I'm really going to take that to the board. I think it's stupid, but I'm not insulted. I'm saying, hey, your numbers are bad here. We need to recorrect the numbers. But I'm not mad. I'm not going to, and that's the difference. It's, you got to remove yourself because fights need to be intellectual, not personal.
Mm-hmm. Where do you see sort of the next transition?
Well, I'm not a predictor. I know where I'd like to be, and that's where we have more honesty, that we say things up front, that we allow people to be surprised or shocked or amazed or name it. I think one of our problems with identity and preciousness is that we don't tell the truth and name what we are in a way that makes people feel comfortable. And so we separate them. And I'll give you a quick example of my dear friend Fauzia. Fauzia is from Pakistan, has no accent, talks just as North American as everyone else, but she wears a hijab. She teaches here and teaches a diversity class that I've helped her with. And she came to me a few years ago and said, I have this whole class. I have 26 white kids. And I don't feel a connection with them. They don't feel a connection with me. They're really uncomfortable with me. And I don't know what to do. And so my question is, do they know you're Muslim? And she bursts out laughing. She said, well, of course they do. Look at me. And I said, no, that's not the question. Do they know you're Muslim? And she said, I don't know what you're saying. I said, have you ever named yourself as a Muslim? She said, no, I don't want to do that. And I said, well, in my opinion, in my work, working in the South Bronx, I found that the first few months when I would go work at a high school, the kids were, kids love me. I'm a youth person, and I thought they would just, but they didn't. And I was working in a class of poetry that was doing hip hop and spoken word. And I was working with them and I had a good stuff for them, but they just didn't love me. And I want to be loved as a high school teacher, And so when I started the next semester, it was a new group. And I thought, I don't think they get me. And so I walked in, South Bronx, Walton High, all Latino, Black, everybody, most of them never been to Manhattan. And I walk in and they said, Dr. Steinberg's coming to work with you on this project. And I walked in and I said, I guess you're all wondering what this white Jewish woman is going to talk to you about hip hop. And they just burst into laughter, and two girls right in the front. She did not just say she's white. And today, this day, these kids still write to me. And what it was is that I put myself out there. And what I've learned about that is we think in racial and ethnic codes. We think in codes. And you know this, the two of you. I'm sure there's been time in life that people were thinking in their head, that's a Jew, but you wouldn't talk about it. And that's what we do racially. We Black people know they're Black and they know we're white, but we deny we're white and we know they're Black. And that's kind of the difference. Naming it makes a difference. Naming uncomfortability makes a difference. Mm-hmm. And so Fauzia, I told her this story. And so she went into class and she said, it's funny, it's a diversity class, but I've never told you that I was Muslim. And they all started to laugh. And she said, oh, you knew that. And then she started to talk about this. And I was in the class. And she would talk about, and all of a sudden the whole class was laughing and joking and warm. And then she had them do an activity that I have my kids do, and just say, I am, and they write it on a piece of card. What are you? And so they all laughed, and talked about what they talked about. And it's so simple. It's so easy. That creates bridges to understand who we are. And instead of obsessing about who they are, letting them know that you too understand your privilege and who you are. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that would be a number one thing, that teachers or people who work with students are able to hook into a vulnerability of understanding who we each are. And that woman I was talking to, the woman who was insulted about me making fun of women with gray hair, only I wasn't. I was just saying, I don't want to be one of them, and for people who didn't hear the beginning of this, women of gray hair, I was making a joke about women of my age who let their hair grow really long gray and walk around in Birkenstocks and try to be cool. And so I was making a joke. It was just a joke, but a woman was very insulted. But if she had just written to me and said, Shirley, I'm so sorry you feel uncomfortable with gray hair. I have gray hair and I really love my gray hair, but I can understand how, she could have made a relationship with me instead of writing me, say, how dare you have the audacity to mention women with gray hair? And so can we find a way to take a moment to be peaceful and just think how we say things and how we voice them? How can we do that? How do we teach about diversity in a non-diverse class or a diverse class? How do we not intimidate or embarrass, but allow voices to be heard? And that's, I'm not going to give you a recipe on how to do it, but how can we be more considerate and not so precious about things that in the long run, in the middle of virus, the world has ice caps melting. Yemen is in its 1000th year of a war, annihilation, child slavery, death, disaster. How can we be so petty about something about our own positionality? And if we start understanding others with their positionality and naming ours, maybe we can have more of a conversation. So that would be something I hope for, is that we don't become a world of us and them, her and me, that we just understand that just sounds like traditional humanism, but it is. And where is our humanism? Where is our human? And I feel like we're dehumanizing ourselves constantly. And the smarter we become, so be careful of those Benjamin books. The smarter we become, the more arrogant we are. Although, Marla, I've never seen you. You are confident with your intellect, but never arrogant. But how can we humbly suggest that we do have somewhere that we can reach over? And if Fauzia can reach out to these truck driving Alberta kids, who just have never been around a brown person in their lives, and name what she is, but make it fun and laugh and ask questions, then she made a difference. The young Muslim women here in Canada have a movement called Ask Me About My Hijab. And the idea is, I'm not going to lecture you about what I believe, but don't you really want to ask me? And so it's really worked, because it's interesting how many people just really, why is she wearing that? Many people make an assumption that a Muslim woman in a hijab is oppressed by her husband, miserable, and all those TV shows that Israel often directs about how she's being treated. And yet some of the strongest, most assertive women I know are Muslim women with hijabs. But the problem is in the lack of conversation. So how do we make a difference? Now, I have to give my last moment on that is to say, however, I'm not going to be one to say, tell me about the Klan to Buddy Jim Bob down the street, because I kind of think I know. So I'm not going to go reach out into danger just to try to reach across. But I do believe that the crazies aren't the people that are our aim. It's the majority of people in the world that just can't communicate. So that's what I hope for. I'd like you to read Adorno. I'd like you to read Gramsci. I'd like you to read Britzman, read Morris, read Chapman, read Dahl, Mary. But just
And Steinberg.
Steinberg, read Kinchlow. But just try to give blessings to the other person. That's it. Just give them a blessing in your head of just, you're a human and I'm a human. And I really want to truly reach across and be a human with you.